Hello, everybody in Humanities 105, checking in again for our weekly YouTube session. I hope you've been keeping up with everything as well. And figure I'll kick off with a little bit of class-related business. So, you've had your weekly reading tests. Those will keep on rolling through these next couple of weeks here. And then you've had your discussion board posts as well. Seems like folks have been keeping up pretty well at that stuff. So I think we've adjusted fairly well to how class has been upended in the second half of the semester here. Probably not quite a perfect substitute for a world where the COVID-19 breakout or outbreak didn't happen, but beggars can't be choosers, and I think we've done pretty well for ourselves in the circumstances here. Hope you all have still managed to feel like you're learning a fair bit. So I did want to mention really quickly, if you haven't seen it already, the writing prompt for your final essay has been up on Brightspace since last week. The first half of that, which is writing a proposal, is due by, I believe it's due by this next Sunday, which is a week from right now as I'm sitting here. And essentially, what the proposal consists of is stating what your topic is, and you can write about any particular thing within the wide world of the mass media. My biggest advice is just to be as specific as possible. We're going to all talk about all of the music industry today. Obviously, we won't talk about absolutely everything, but you would not want to talk about the music industry. Way too broad a topic for a final essay. You would want to talk about one particular recording artist or recording format, recording company, record label, music station, or music station format, genre, something like that. The more specific, the better, right? So instead of all of music, maybe it's just Billie Eilish or something like that. If you like Billie Eilish, I like Bad Guy. I don't know about the rest. I hope that makes sense. The more specific, the better. So your proposal, you're stating the topic, you're stating what your thesis about that topic is. You're not just going to be doing research on this topic. You want to present an argument about them, share some sort of critical perspective. There's a lot of ways of figuring out what your thesis is, and don't feel like you have to have a thesis. Oftentimes, the best way of creating a thesis is to come back to that after you've done your research, and research is part of this proposal. But my favorite way of stating this is that a thesis can either set out to prove a point, Billie Eilish is X because Y, or it tries to answer a question. Why is X? Why do people feel X way about Billie Eilish or something like that, right? So you're stating topic, stating your thesis, providing your bibliography. That's the research material that you'll have spent time finding and looking through and collecting information about the relevant topic for you. You have to have at least 5 resources for your works cited page there. Formatting is up to you, whatever proper citation format you work with. And then you also have to have an outline for your full essay. Similar to outlines I'm sure you've done in writing courses, sort of A, B, C, D, laying out main blocks of content here. And it is worth noting, you're going to be analyzing your content through those same 3 lenses we've used throughout the entire semester: business, technology, and culture. So those certainly can provide a framework for your outline. But the actual sort of warp and weft, which is a really old-fashioned phrase, the actual flow of your argument and how that all relates back to the thesis and is resolved by the conclusion is in your hands, but I will be grading the proposal and providing written feedback to everybody. I do want to mention, usually I provide written feedback on Turnitin, but I'm not 100% sure everybody knows where to find written feedback on Turnitin. So if you next week see a score for your proposal on Brightspace, but you don't know where to find the written feedback, email me and I'll either give you instructions on where to find it. It's a good thing to know how to find, or I can just copy and paste it as well. But regardless, you'll get my feedback before the full essay which is due at the end of finals week, which is already only a few weeks away. As strange as it feels, and I think it's because the weather has been so shitty. Doesn't feel like it's almost the end of the semester, but I will be submitting final grades something like 3.5 weeks from right now, so that's happening fast. Anyway, you've got all of that in front of you. You've got the final essay work, regular work for the next few weeks, and then you'll take the final exam through Brightspace a few weeks afterwards. And then beyond that, we've still got a little bit more material to run through, so let's go ahead and do that right now. So our topic for this week, as I'd mentioned, is the music business. Big topic. Could spend a lot of time about it. Obviously, you could take many classes about it here at Harold Washington College. We are not going to cover everything, of course, but we're going to talk about it in the same way we have everything else. So, when you talk about the music industry, you're actually talking about two different forms of mass media, arguably even more in the digital age. But at the simplest level, the music industry is divided into the recording business and the radio business. And you can almost look at that as like the content business and the distribution business, though that is maybe too much of a simplification. They are both creating content and distributing content. Regardless, let's start on the recording side of things. Sound recording technology was invented back in the electronic era. The very first experiment along these lines was done in the 1850s. And it's a shame we're not in class because it's really cool to talk about this process with all of you kind of there asking questions. But essentially, sound as we perceive it is created by vibrations in the air around us. And so scientists started tinkering with ways to capture those vibrations and put them into some kind of physical storage capacity. The first person to work this up was a French inventor. I think he used a horsehair bristle at the end of a cone that would make waves, make kind of it would shake according to the vibration of the sound coming through. This was recorded into wax, if I'm remembering correctly, and actually just in the past couple of years, scientists using digital technology like optically read these sounds, and you can listen to this French. I think it's a French song or a French person speaking from the 1850s. And like, how spooky does that sound when you say it like that way? You can go online and find a French person speaking 170 years ago. That's not creepy. It is. It's a little creepy. Um, Sound recording obviously has come a long way since then. There's four major recording formats in the time period. The first of them to be commercially viable is the phonograph, invented by Thomas Edison back in the 1870s, 1880s. It used that same physical medium idea, grooves on cylinders, and eventually evolved instead of cylinders into flat discs, records as we know them today. The highest quality of these were the vinyl records, which are first created in the 1940s. Vinyl is a composite material that creates a nice, warm, almost glowing sound. If you listen to really early phonograph recordings, it sounds like somebody is shouting at you down a hall through a closed door and they've got their hand over their mouth. Whereas records maybe don't sound exactly like real life. They might even sound a little richer than real life. Um, they sound good. They became popular. Um, Now, records are actually seeing a little bit of a resurgence these days, but we have had many other recording formats since then. Magnetic tape is invented in the 1940s. That becomes very popular, not necessarily for customers for a while, though eventually that is the case. 8 tracks in the 60s and 70s, and then cassette tapes in the 70s, 80s, and 90s are popular ways of listening to music. But magnetic tape is very popular on the production side of things because it allows for multi track recording. A big band, for example, Duke Ellington and his orchestra, they could all record their sessions, as it's called, separately. Duke Ellington on the piano by himself, the singers by themselves, the horns by themselves, that sort of thing. And then the producers would mix all of them together rather than having the whole band in its kind of messy, noisy, all at oneness, if that makes sense, recording onto one record at one time. So tape begins more as a production, maybe high end exhibition and distribution method before becoming more popular in smaller formats later on in the century. The next big recording format, first invented back in the 1970s, sees its heyday in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, is CDs, the compact disc. I would actually wager for most Americans, CDs were probably the first form of digital technology that they ever encountered, because CDs, I'm sure you're still, I hope you're, if one of you doesn't know, has never handled a CD, mention it in the YouTube comments. I want to know. Like, if this is becoming, if we're reaching a point where I'm referencing CDs and my students are like, I don't know what that is. I want to be aware of that. But CDs are small discs. I think they're about 6 centimeters across. 8 centimeters? They're small. Clear plastic coating on the outside with a magnetic filament, a thin piece of metal on the inside. The thin piece of metal is scored by a laser with either bumps or grooves. Those correspond to ones and zeros, which are then interpreted by a reading laser on your compact disc player, a Discman, for example, and those ones and zeros are eventually compiled into the sound that you are hearing. I Want to Dance with Somebody by Whitney Houston or something like that. That's how all optical discs work. CDs, DVDs, Blu-rays, all of them are using that same technology. They just have more capacity based on the format. CDs are still around, still sold these days, though obviously at a much lower pace than in the further past. And then the recording format and distribution format that's most popular these days is MP3, which is an acronym that you do not need to learn the official, the lengthened version of. I think it's something like microcompression process number 3 or something like that. It doesn't matter that much. Essentially, this is a file format that takes all the data in the recording of a song, which can be quite a lot of it, and compresses it into a smaller file format so that you can store more of them on your computer, laptop, desktop, phone, taking up much less space while not losing out on sound quality. That's invented back in the 1990s and becomes the bedrock for digital music, initially through file sharing services like Napster, but eventually through mobile digital devices, the iPod initially in the 2000s. And it's incredible to note this. The iPod was first released in 2001. It held like 200 songs. It had battery life for 6 hours, and it cost like $500. That was all it did. It's incredible to say that. They're literally museum pieces at this point. But obviously, phones have much that same functionality today. And most streaming services, so Spotify, Pandora, uh, or Apple Music, that sort of thing. Even if you're streaming that music, you're streaming an MP3 file through that streaming format. So that's the technology of the recording business there. Technology of the radio industry is basically the exact same as the technology of the TV broadcasting systems I had talked about last week. I think it was last week. And that's essentially because TV came along and got commercialized 20 years after radio, which was invented back in the 1920s. I believe the first radio message ever that like carried a person's voice was "Hello, hello, is it snowing where you are?" Perfect. Um, but radio is invented in the 1920s. Becomes a mass medium almost immediately. Very first radio broadcast is 1920. By 1930, everybody in America is listening to radio. It was what you did after dinner. And I want you to imagine that for a minute here. It's a fun thought experiment, especially in the days of coronavirus. Imagine sitting in your living room after dinner, and the primary form of family entertainment is listening to the radio. There's nothing visual unless you're ignoring the radio and like reading the newspaper or a book or something like that. It's a slower time, you might say. But radio uses that same technology of local radio wave distribution, reliant on the transmission antennas here in Chicago, they're located in downtown, that carry the local radio stations' content to local audiences, maximum distribution range of about 50 miles from where the antenna is. So you get about 50 miles from the Hancock Center or the Sears Tower, and you start losing the signal for the local radio stations. And then they have national networks that they're affiliated with as well. Jumping to the business side of things, why don't we jump back to recording? The recording industry is a very tight oligopoly. Only three major record companies companies in the global music market. There's Universal Music Group, not owned by the same company that owns Universal Pictures. Universal Music is owned by a French company called Vivendi. Universal Pictures, as you might recall, is owned by Comcast. The copyright got split back in the 1990s. There's the Warner Music Group, which is part of Warner Media, as I recall. I think, or they may have split it off. No, I think it is part of Warner Media, which means it's owned by AT&T. And then there's the Sony Music Group, which obviously is the Sony Corporation. That's actually one brand that hasn't gotten split yet. We'll wait and see. But those three companies control something like 75% of the American music marketplace, a very tight oligopoly. But it is worth noting they have lost a lot of money in the past 20 years or so. In the year 2000, if I'm recalling the stat from the textbook correctly, annual revenue for the music industry was something like $14 billion, which is roughly the same ballpark as something like the movie industry or the video game industry was making annually, somewhere between around like $15 billion a year. That has fallen off a cliff. I believe the most recent stats in the textbook in 2014 had the annual revenue of the music industry in the ballpark of $6 billion. That decline is obviously pretty gargantuan. A business that loses more than a half of its total value in a little over a decade is not a business that I would want to invest in. Obviously, people still want to listen to music, but there's been a huge amount of revenue lost as the music industry moved online. A lot of that was lost to piracy, of course, but also people stopped being willing to shell out $20 for a CD. Not just because who listens to music on CDs anymore, but because CDs make you buy a whole album, 12 songs. Maybe you don't like all of them. Maybe you only want to listen to Bad Guy by Billie Eilish and not all the other Billie Eilish songs that you're not familiar with. So these days you would maybe just get that one song, just sample their other music through a service like Spotify. But those sorts of services, Spotify, YouTube, Pandora, they pay way less, way less than per play than would be seen through other forms of distribution. Something like Spotify, I think it's something like if there is a song, excuse me, if there's a song that's like a number one hit around the world, Spotify pays the record company that owns the copyright to that something like $50,000 for a number one song globally. That's nothing. Like I say, like $50,000. Please give me $50,000. I would love it. But if you're a global corporation, that is nothing. You should be making a lot more than that if you've got a song like Bad Guy. So the margins have gotten tighter, the amount of revenue has collapsed, and it raises a lot of questions about what the future of the recording industry is. It is probably not an accident, for example, that radio stations have been shutting down, that record companies have been losing money, and that most musicians make the bulk of their money through live performances, which obviously is going to be impacted by the lockdown. Which I mean, I've seen reports that live events like sports and concerts might not come back until 2021, like the summer or fall of 2021. There are going to be a lot of broke musicians and a lot of record companies that maybe will see this as an opportunity to grow, but they haven't grown very spectacularly the past 20 years or so. Radio has seen much the same thing, probably even smaller revenue for radio in the past 20 years, just because the digital revolution has meant a huge amount of people have left behind older forms of communication for, all the things that your smartphone can do. Now, lastly, the cultural side of this, and this is where recording and radio blend together to a fair degree, is huge. It's absolutely enormous in terms of the cultural impact that music has on us, both in terms of the in a million different ways. But I do want to point out, music is rarely something that's enjoyed in isolation. Usually, the music that we consume is tied to its producers in some way, the musicians that make it, the companies that release it, and especially if it's pop music, to the celebrity status of the people that are involved. Like, I hate to say it, you can't listen to Kanye West without, you know, all of Kanye being present when you listen to Gold Digger. And something like I don't know, Beyonce's Lemonade is something that is not just a piece of music, but it's deeply tied to the other media that supported it. The what did she call it? A visual album or something like that, with all the accompanying music videos and concerts and stuff like that. So I do think it's worth noting that music is interestingly one a form of mass media that rarely stands on its own, just as music. I also think it's interesting to note that music, from a cultural perspective, is different than other forms of major entertainment, and that it can tell stories. Music certainly can tell stories, but it's not necessarily the only thing we look for there, right? If a movie or a TV show doesn't tell a good story, it's probably not good for many of us. But if a song doesn't tell a good story, do you care? Does it even matter? Like, if you go look at the lyrics to Uptown Funk, you read through them, will you be impressed by the poetry and by the narrative clarity and, you know, unity on display there? No, probably not. But if you listen to Uptown Funk, it funks you up, right? The beat, the rhythm, the performance, they are as affecting as everything else. That's the medium as the message, once again. Uptown Funk is nothing as poetry, but it is everything as music, because the music is more powerful than the words. The words are just the filler that we glob onto. The beat, the instrumentation, the vocal delivery, that's really what we respond to in music. I think that's also interestingly, I might tie that as well to one of the other things that I always like to bring up when it comes to music. I think maybe more than any other form of mass media, music can be deeply personal. There are probably songs, maybe even whole artists, but maybe particular songs that feel like a part of you. Like, if somebody had to understand you, maybe it was this song that would let people know who you are, how you conceive of yourself, how you present yourself, and maybe even deeper than that, like who you are underneath all of those surface layers. And that's something I'm always a little bit curious about, so I will probably turn that into one of our discussion board prompts this week. Why is music something so deeply personal? And not, you don't have to share any more than you want to, but what music out there is something that means a lot to you on a personal level. Not just something that you like, but something that is a part of your identity. All right, that is all for now. As always, let me know if you have any questions through email or in our Zoom sessions, and I will see everybody in the discussion boards.